today. So hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar. My name is Katie Brown and I'm the Director of Government Relations here at the Association for Community College Trustees, or ACCT for short. For those on the call who may be unfamiliar with ACCT, we are a nonprofit organization and we represent more than 6,500 elected and appointed trustees who govern over 1,200 community, technical, and junior colleges across the US. The trustees we represent are deeply steeped in higher education issues and very passionate about promoting high quality education, cutting edge workforce training programs, and promoting student success. Today, myself and our fantastic panelists, whom you will hear from shortly, will be talking about improving access and affordability of workforce training with short-term Pell. On the left side of the screen on the PowerPoint, you'll see our Twitter handle, which is CC Trustees, and you'll also see my favorite hashtag that we use, Pell Yes. And so I encourage you, if you're active on Twitter, to tweet at us as you follow along the webinar, or tweet about the topic. It's great to elevate it out on the Twitters. I also want to note that this webinar is the second one in a series of 3 webinars that ACCT is doing around Pell. We have done one already on increasing the Pell Maximum Award, and we are doing a 3rd one on December 3rd that's focused on Second Chance Pell. And so if you go to our website, which is acct.org, you'll see the landing page for this series, and you'll be able to watch this webinar and also the previous webinar we did, as well as register for the Second Chance Pell webinar if you're interested. So I just wanted to make that note. And Jose, you can go to the next slide. Perfect. Okay, so just some guidelines for the webinar. So all of you that are participating today are muted. So if you have questions throughout the webinar that you would like to ask myself or the panelists, you can click on the Q&A icon that should be at the bottom of your screen, and you can type in your question in the chat window. If you would like to direct your question towards a specific panelist, feel free to note that. And then other folks on the webinar who are watching will be able to upvote questions if they also want to hear the answer. So that'll help us get to some of the more popular questions at the end of the webinar, and any question we don't get to today, we'll definitely be following up. So feel free to put all your questions in the Q&A box. And then just another note that this event is being recorded and it will be available on our website afterwards. And so before we get started with our discussion, before we jump in, I'd like to provide just a brief overview of the topic that we're going to be discussing today. We're going to be talking a lot about the Pell Grant program and how the Pell Grant program is extremely significant in terms of student access. And the Pell Grant program was established back in the 1970s by Congress, and the intent of the program is to make higher education more affordable. And in the 70s, when the program was created, a lot of students, actually, I think more than 75% of students at the time were under 24 years old. So the Pell Grant program is historically geared towards more traditional students that are going to school full time, living on campus, to help them be able to afford higher education. Since the creation of the Pell Grant program, we've seen the need for post-secondary and education and training go up. Today's jobs, 80% of them require some form of post-secondary education or training beyond the high school level. And so because of this, because education and training has become so important, we've seen Congress kind of revisit the Pell Grant program and make some tweaks to make sure that the Pell Grant program is responsive to today's students. And one of the ways that Congress can do that is by taking a look at this larger landscape of the types of post-secondary education and training programs that are out there and available to students today. So we know that the higher education landscape has changed and evolved quite a bit. A lot of our community and technical colleges offer high quality, short-term workforce-oriented programs that can help students get the skills they need to launch into a job or launch into a larger or longer educational pathway. And so we've seen an interest in taking a look at the Pell Grant program and making it more amenable to those students. Currently, students have to be enrolled in a program that is at least 600 clock hours over 15 weeks of instruction, or about 2/3 of a year in length, to qualify for a Pell Grant program. And as you'll hear today, that leaves out a large subset of students who want to enroll in these short-term workforce-oriented programs. And those students can be more non-traditional. They can be student parents, they can be working full or part-time while attending school, they can be older. And so this is a crucial policy proposal that a lot of our community colleges and technical college partners support. And it's one of our top priorities at ACCT to make Pell Grants available to students attending programs shorter than 600 clock hours. And we'll hear about a couple of specific proposals during our panel discussion. And so, I would be remiss not to mention the pandemic and how that's also kind of impacted the way that Americans are looking at education and training programs. Strata did a study recently asking, how people would react if they lost their job to the pandemic. And a lot of them said that they would change careers if they lost their job, which means that they would need to reskill. The study also showed, and you'll see the graph on the right, that a lot of Americans would prefer non-degree programs or skills training programs over traditional degree pathways, just as a way to launch themselves back into the workforce and get reskilled. So that's also something that we're going to be talking about today. Is there's already a demand for short-term programs that are workforce oriented, but I think the pandemic will drive up that demand even more. And so just some of the topics that we'll be covering today, our panelists are going to be providing examples of what these short-term programs are. They're going to be talking about the role that they play in the lives of students. They're going to be talking about how students being able to access these programs through financial aid is super important when it comes to equity and inclusion. And they're also going to be providing an overview of the federal policy landscape as it relates to this issue. And that includes, pieces of legislation that have been introduced that would lower the Pell Grant clock hour threshold, and, maybe major pieces of legislation that might include a proponent of that. And so we're going to now introduce our panelists. And I do want to make a note, Adele Malone, who is a student at the Community College of Baltimore County and is also working at the Social Security Administration. She was going to be joining the panel today, but due to unforeseen circumstances, she is unable to be here. So I'm hoping that I'll be able to weave some of her student story into this discussion, and hopefully you'll see her on future panels. But I'm gonna start with Julie Peller. Julie is the Executive Director at Higher Learning Advocates, and I'm gonna kick it over to you, Julie, to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Katie, and hi everyone. Nice to be with you virtually here today. My name is Julie Peller. I lead an organization based here in Washington, D.C. that advocates for federal policy change for today's students, really recognizing that who are on your campuses and campuses across the country are not who federal policy is written for, which is very much so that 18 to 22-year-old playing frisbee on the quad. So we're fighting here in Washington to change that and update the policies.
Great, thanks so much, Julie. Next, I'll turn to Quentin Taylor, who's the Chief Public Affairs Officer at Louisiana Community and Technical College System.
Sure, so thanks for having me here today, Katie. I'm Quentin Taylor, Chief Public Affairs Officer for the Louisiana Community and Technical College System. We're a comprehensive system of community and technical colleges, 12 colleges across the state, where we serve approximately 160,000 students across 3 different mission points. Your traditional academic student, we have your workforce student, and then we also are responsible for the state's adult basic education services.
Fantastic, thanks, Quentin. And last but not least, we have Steve Jurch, who's the Assistant Dean of Health and Business Services at the Community College of Baltimore County. Steve?
Thanks, Katie, and thanks for having me, and good afternoon to everyone. So as Katie was saying, my name is Steve Jurch. I'm the Assistant Dean for Health and Business Services, but that is on the workforce development side of the college. So I'm at the Community College of Baltimore County, which is one of 16 community colleges in the state of Maryland. We have about 62,000 students. So we are, depending on what metric you look at, the largest community college in the state. And we have 3 main campuses and 3 extension centers. And half of our enrollment comes from that non-credit workforce development, community education side, and about half is on the credit side.
Fantastic. Thanks, Steve. And with that, we'll close out of the PowerPoint for now, and we will start our moderated panelist discussion. Great. So Quentin, I'm going to start off with you. So I mentioned at the top of the call, and you mentioned as well in your introductory remarks, that a lot of community and technical colleges make it a priority to offer these shorter term programs to students, or at least make them available. So I'd love if you could kick off by talking about the types of programs and some examples of programs that LCTCS offers, and then why the system makes it a priority to do so.
So yeah, thanks. And it's a great question, Katie. I think fundamentally, it just boils down to what are we going to do to prepare adults, quite frankly. In my mind, this is an adult discussion, right? Julie made the point that right now policy is really established and made for that 18-year-old high school student, when in reality, our skills gap and quite frankly, I think our wealth gap can be directly tied to the fact that we have millions of adults in this country with a high school diploma or less, right? And we know that, and it was in the comments that 80% of the jobs require more than a high school diploma. And so when you've got millions of adults, you've got jobs that are available, but they don't have a means to get to the training that requires to get them to the job, that's a fundamental problem. And what we know is time and money are the enemy, right? When we were 18, you had time to go to school for 4 or 5 years. If you were like me, you were on a 6-year plan because you had so much fun, right? But adults don't have that margin. They don't have time to go and sit in a class or even do it virtually for 2 years, right? Let alone 4 years. And so we realized that. And so what we've done is we've canceled or discontinued a lot of programs, some that were very popular. But when we looked at the bigger scheme of things, we realized that the programs that we offered, this very large menu, if you completed, some of those were not good programs. We were putting people in the position to, we tell them, go to school, earn a degree, and go to work. But if you go to school and earn a degree in a program that, quite frankly, is not going to lead to a livable wage where you can sustain yourself and take care of your family, what have we really done? But in some cases, saddle people with debt, right? And so what we've done is we've been very strategic in our 8 regions across the state. We've sat down, and we do this 3 to 4 times a year. Well, I'm sorry, twice a year, where we sit with economic development organizations and we say, please tell us what programs or what jobs are available today so that we can then align our program offering with the regional demand. So that way we're not sending students to dead-end pathways. We're sending them to pathways that are, number one, going to be short in nature, right? We try to do 8 weeks or less because, again, we talked about time being the enemy. The second part of that is those programs, while they do lead to really good paying jobs, guess what? They're not cheap. And when you're talking about a population of folks who, quite frankly, don't have the resources or the wherewithal to pay for those courses, and I'll give you an example, transportation and logistics, it is absolutely booming in the state of Louisiana, with the Port of New Orleans, one of the largest ports in the country. So even despite the pandemic, commerce is moving, right? That hasn't stopped. But where are people we're gonna find the people to fill those jobs? And then if people can afford a $7,500 program, what are we doing, right? And so what we finding is that we're having to now step in and fill that void, right? And I'll talk about one of the programs that we're doing that with and trying to help some of these adults pay for these courses. But we've got to do a better job. And that's why I'm so happy that we're having this discussion. I'm happy that Julie and her team over at ELA, they're doing what they're trying to do, because we've got to find a way to make sure that adults with families and children and responsibilities can become self-sufficient and can provide for their family by getting access to these programs and then going to work. So short answer is it's important, these short-term programs are, because if we don't fill them, these jobs are not being filled by 19-year-old kids. Right? These are jobs that require some maturity, that require skill, and that, quite frankly, require adults to step in and fill those roles.
That's great. Thanks, Quentin. And I'm glad that you brought up the point of cost too, because I think, and we'll talk about this more as we go, but I think a lot of, some of the misconception around short-term programs is, okay, well, if they're short, they don't cost as much, and maybe students don't need as much support to be able to enroll in them. But as we've seen, there's a plethora and variety of these programs, and they often come with equipment costs and kind of other student costs. So I think that was a really good point. Steve, I'll turn to you, kind of similar question, but I know CCBC has a robust offering of these short-term workforce-oriented programs in several different areas. Can you provide some examples of these programs and then share your thoughts on why they're valuable to students?
Sure, and I think it's a nice segue from Quentin, because I'm gonna echo a lot of the things that he was saying. And our program offerings range from building and industrial training, business and management, health and human services, computer IT. So we have the gamut of program offerings. But like Quentin was saying, we tailor our offerings to what the business community needs. We're not just going to offer programs just to offer them. We really have a strong, we get our direction from the business community. So we have program advisory committees. We work with our local workforce boards. For the health and human services area, there is a healthcare intermediary in Baltimore City called Baltimore Alliance for Careers in Healthcare, and they are made up of healthcare employers. We're one of the main training providers, so we get our direction. They come to us and say, I have these employers, they need these individuals, and we provide the training for that. So, so our programs will range from 8 to 12 weeks to 15 months, depending on, what we're training for. So, but I think the key is that we take our cues from the business community.
Absolutely. Thanks, Steve. And I know, again, this will come up, so not to put the cart before the horse, but a lot of these programs, as you mentioned, are created hand in hand with business leaders and industry leaders. And so there's a lot of, teamwork on making sure that these programs lead to jobs that exist and jobs that employers need to fill. So I think that's a great point. Julie, Can
I add one more thing, Kate?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And along that point, I would say that one of the advantages of these short-term programs versus longer degree programs is we are much more responsive to the business community. So to Quentin's point, if we have a program that's a degree-based program and it's not needed anymore, it takes a while to phase it out. Whereas if it's a credential-based short-term program, we can start and stop based on demand in a pretty short period of time. So we are much more responsive to the business community, which in turn puts people back to work quicker.
That's a great point, Steve.
Absolutely. Thank you. Julie, I'm going to turn to you. I did some table setting at the top about kind of federal policy and how the Pell Grant got started and how it's evolved a little bit. But I do think, we've both spent time on Capitol Hill. I think the acknowledgement that higher education is more than just a four-year degree to a lot of students. I think that has been happening also on the Hill. I think there's been more awareness, but it's taken a little longer. But you have a lot of experience working in the higher education policy space, spending time on Capitol Hill. Can you share your perspective about how the higher education policy landscape has changed from being focused just on traditional four-year education to acknowledging the role that these programs that Quentin and Steve just described play in equipping people for the workforce and or putting them on a path to a longer educational program?
Well, thanks, Katie. So you're right. In the in the 70s, in the beginning of the Pell Grant program, frankly, until I would say the last couple of years, higher education policy has been driven by the fact that the four-year degree is the gold standard, and that's what we should be driving students and families toward, and where our policy has really been centered on. Federal policymakers say, great, shorter term training, workforce-related training, that needs to exist. That exists over at the Department of Labor through the Workforce Investment Opportunity Act and those programs. And long-standing federal policymakers have said, degrees over here, workforce training over there. As we all know, that is not the reality on the ground. Students are existing in programs that live in the middle there. Institutions certainly, like the programs that we just heard about here, are in the middle there, where we're talking about building blocks and pathways. And so I think the recognition as federal policy gets to be more student-centered and more individual-centered rather than institution-centered, recognizing that we can't put people in one box or the other that cannot speak to one another, that there really needs to be places where people don't hit roadblocks in federal policy.
Great point. Thanks, Julie. Yeah, I think there was historically a divide, and I think we're starting to break down that wall, which is good news. Yeah. I'm going to turn to you, Steve, in talking about kind of how the federal government has moved towards modernizing the Pell program. There was an initiative that came out of the Department of Education in 2011. It was known as an experimental site, and it was basically called the Short-Term Pell Experimental Site. And basically what that did is it allowed a sample of institutions to offer Pell Grants to students attending approved programs that were between 150 and 600 clock hours, so long as they were at least 8 weeks of instruction. And I know that CCBC participated in that short-term Pell experimental site. I'd love to get just your thoughts about CCBC's participation and any kind of major takeaways you all took from that.
Sure, and I would start by saying that we actually have, I think we have 5 programs now on the workforce side that are actually full Pell programs. So they are over 600 hours. And so the institutions do have that ability. If the program is more than 600 hours, they just have to do a clock hour calculation when awarding Pell, and there's some challenges around, payment disbursements. But so we have 3 in healthcare, and 1 in manufacturing, and 1 in CDL and diesel mechanics. So we do have full-blown Pell programs. But to your point on experimental Pell, that was, I think we participated in that, or it was just finishing up when I joined the college about 6 years ago. And I think so when I had done some discussion around this before, and I think one of the big things we took away from it was some of the challenges. So it was a relatively small, I guess, study. And the way it was set up, it was a random controlled trial. So you had students come in, they would apply, and they would get put in one of 2 buckets, either Pell funded or not Pell funded. And what we found was, I understand the idea of, wanting to see, does this funding help students complete? Well, the students that didn't get the funding, I think we only had 14 of those, 11 didn't enroll at all. So essentially, if they didn't get funding, they didn't go through the program. So essentially the study didn't do what it was, I think, intended to do. And so, there was also, because it was clock hour calculations, there was some, challenges around student disbursements and sort of tracking, communication with the students, those types of challenges. I think, so it was hard to, I guess, get a real good gauge on, whether it was a valuable study in itself. But what I do think it did is it really sort of brought to light the importance of some type of funding for these short-term programs, whether, based on, and I don't think They've actually released the report around that, from my understanding. But whether it was that's the mechanism, I don't know that in the larger scheme of things. I don't know that that's it doesn't necessarily matter what the mechanism is. It matters that the mechanism is there. I think having that funding available was made very aware. It was, is experimental Pell the way to do it? I'm not sure. I think something has to be done. I think that's a good way to do it. But I think that study was a bit challenging to participate in, and so I don't know if that sheds light on anything, but I'm happy to expand or follow up or whatever we need to do.
No, I think that's great. I think, the point of cost being a disincentive, for students to continue or even to take the first step of enrolling in a program, that might seem like an obvious takeaway, but I think like seeing it in practice and, having that experience of being a part of the Pell site and having that be the outcome, I think that's a really important takeaway. So thank you so much for sharing that. I'm going to turn to Quentin, and I know we did mention partnering with business and industry to stand up these programs, Quentin, but I know you all do a lot of that at LCTCS. So I just wanted, there might be some folks on the webinar now who do work at community colleges, but, want to expand their business partnerships, or folks who work on the policies who, want to hear a little bit more about the importance of these partnerships and how they start. So I'd love to turn it over to you to talk a little bit about those.
No, absolutely. And so in Steve's previous comment, he talked about letting industry basically drive the discussion in terms of what programs that we're going to offer. And it's really, I consider it to be it's a skill set, quite frankly. It's business development, but just in a different form, right? It's sales and marketing, but just kind of in a different form. And so we have several relationships, and then I'll just give an example. Praxair, which is a liquid gas, one of the world's largest liquid gas company, just changed their name to Lindy. They had a huge need for drivers, right? And transportation and logistics is just one of our biggest pieces right now, along with healthcare. And so the example I'll give is with Praxair, where they needed drivers. They also needed warehouse folks, but they couldn't find the people. They just couldn't find them. And so while the area in the state in which they needed this program to be stood up, we had a CDL program there, but we couldn't churn them out quick enough. And so they came to the table and said, hey, we need about 100 people total over the next year. What can we do to help grow your program so you can help meet our demand? And so we got together, and it was a collaborative effort to make the curriculum that we already had, to make it more robust, to include the different certifications that they needed within. So you just didn't walk away with a CDL, you walked away with a CDL and those other stackable credentials that made you, quite frankly, more marketable if you went to work for Praxair or United States Postal Service, right? It didn't matter where you went, you left with all these different credentials. And so they put their money where their mouth was. I already told you, I mentioned $7,500 on average just to take a CDL course. Who can afford it, right? And so they stepped up and they scholarshiped those 100 people. Well, actually more than that, because we had about 170 people to actually get into the program. Through attrition, people stop coming, things happen, life happens. And so they put their money up, and they actually funded out of their own resources those students to go in and take the Praxair specific curriculum around CDL and logistics and transportation. And then I'm happy to say that we had about a 96% success rate. And so even not everybody went to work for Praxair, but those people that didn't work for Praxair, they were employable, and they are now working somewhere in the market. And so that's just one of the examples. Similar example with Ochsner, the largest hospital organization here in the state of Louisiana, where they too are just needing nurses, right? And I'm assuming it's probably the same across the country, that some of these core programs, we all have the same challenges. And when you have industry to step up and say, hey, I'm going to help you meet my demand, and they're going to put and write a check to do that, I think is great. And so something that's not a part of this discussion, but because I also oversee our foundation, when I talk about a different kind of business development, it is us saying to the industry, hey, we're going to meet your need. We're going to train the people that you need, right? And if you fund it, that's great. But on the back end, we're going to need your support for our foundation, because even with you helping your industry, there's still so many other people who cannot access. And so how can we also use some of the resources that they give to our foundation to go out and do endowments and provide scholarships and other programs so other industries can succeed as well?
That's a great point. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because I do think there's a movement. Like I think when business started being involved in education, it was very like specific to, you know, their business or their industry, as you were saying. But I think there's a movement to kind of share that knowledge and share those relationships out and really make sure that all education at really all levels is responsive to what employers need. So I'm glad that you mentioned that. Julie, I want to turn to you. So I did talk a little bit about some legislation that maybe has come out of Congress that would sort of follow in the footsteps of the short-term Pell experimental site and take an approach of dropping down the clock hour threshold from 600 to lower to try to get students enrolled in these programs eligible for Pell. So I'd love if you could talk us a little bit through some of those proposals and just, you know, talk a little bit about why the Pell Grant is the mechanism to offset the cost of these programs.
Sure. So the prevailing proposal that is out there and that people most often associate with short-term Pell conversations is something called the Jobs Act. Senator Tim Kaine out of Virginia is the champion behind this, although it has many, many other senators and representatives in support of this act. And as Katie mentioned, what it does is it brings that clock hour down. You know, I think over the conversations about this, there have been some key points that the senator and those of us in support of that approach pointed out. So why Pell? Pell grants are an incredibly portable tool from the federal government. The federal government, I often say, federal policy is a hammer. It is a very, very, very blunt tool. Pell grants, because they are vouchers to individuals, are really the most targeted and portable way that we can really ensure students and individuals receive the aid that they need for post-secondary education, and they can make those choices in themselves. Also, from the federal standpoint, and I'm sure Steve and Quentin may resonate with this, from the federal standpoint, the federal investment in workforce, a very, very, very small amount of that actually gets to the individual learner. And so when we're looking at investments in learners, we're, from a federal perspective, we're really looking at the Pell Grant program. So that's why Pell. Another kind of question or thing that comes up, and this is a little bit related to the why Pell, is the connectivity of programs, of shorter term programs with longer term programs. Like I said, longstanding in federal policy, there's been this division between longer term programs belong in Pell, shorter term programs and training programs belong over in workforce. What the Jobs Act does is starts to think through that pathway, ensuring that there's transferability of the learning, at least within the institution, to the credit side, should the learner want to continue that, to ensure that these business-related partnerships and the job outcomes are there. And so the bill really tackles some of these critical things and builds on the learnings, even though the report hasn't come out yet, the learnings from the experimental site, and more importantly, the learnings from programs like you're hearing about today that have already been doing it and figured out what are the elements that work.
Hey, Katie, I just want to piggyback on something Julie just said, and that what we're trying to do here in Louisiana. You're absolutely right, Julie. That WIOA dollars, very small percentage of it actually gets not into the hands of students, but students can actually feel and benefit from. So what we're trying to do, and it is a huge battle, right, is that we're trying to get those WIOA offices on our campuses, right? So if you truly want to impact workforce development, through WIOA funds. Why should I make a person go down to the local strip mall where the WIOA office is and say, okay, these are where you can go, and then send you all the way back across town to the community college or to another private provider, right? Why not have it in one location on the community college campus? So when they walk in the door, right, everything they need is right there. And so it was like pulling whale's teeth, but we were able to convince one of our regions to put the WIOA on one of our campuses at South Louisiana Community College in Lafayette. And in a year's time, the usage of the WIOA dollar has gone up 75%, right? So that's a difference maker. Now, I don't want to get too deep in the weeds, but I suspect around the country, the funding for WIOA is going to make sure that strip mall stays open. It's going to make sure that leases get paid and people have jobs within those buildings. And I get it, but those dollars should really be focused on what their intended purposes are. And I think they should all be housed at community and technical colleges. Just an observation.
Yeah, oh, Steve, go ahead.
I was just going to say we follow that same model. So we actually have two in the county. Two of our workforce boards are co-located at our extension centers. We also have our county's DSS jobs program is housed on one of our campuses, and we also have our we are the implementers of our county youth grant. So what we're doing is we are utilizing the county funds, combining that with technical training and sort of giving them that whole package. But you're right, it's much easier for a student to come to one location and get all the services taken care of.
Yeah, and I was just gonna, for folks on the call who might not be super familiar with WIOA, it stands for the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, and it was a bill passed or just reauthorized in 2014, I'm pretty sure. But it's basically, it was a bill to sort of modernize the federal kind of workforce training framework. And part of WIOA is that individuals who qualify, which the qualification process is a little bit difficult to navigate, to say the least, but individuals who qualify, who want to attend a qualified training program, can receive funding through an individual training account. And oftentimes we hear at the federal level, instead of Pell, those individuals can access their ITA account through WIOA because that's more appropriate for training programs. But it's, again, difficult for a student to navigate, as Julie says, it's not the equivalent of handing a student money to then go to a training program. It's very different. And then, as Quentin and Steve just pointed out, even if it did cover the cost of a program, a student accessing it is very difficult. And there's not kind of a one-stop shop on campuses where students are aware of this option. So that's just another point to make about why we look at the Pell program, because it is already so ingrained in higher ed and the higher ed system, and it's more accessible to students in a lot of ways. And
Katie, can I just add on to that point? And this is actually a comment that came up in the questions here of a differentiator of, the Pell Grant covers beyond tuition. And we know particularly at community colleges where the tuition costs are relatively low, but students still need to get to campus. They still need to put their children in childcare while they're studying. They need to pay bills at home just as much as a traditional student would need to pay for food in the dining hall and their residence hall fees. Students need to eat no matter their age and no matter where they're living. Pell Grant covers a percentage of a lot of those other non-tuition costs that are critical to student success. And many other training provisions pay for the course itself, but not those other ancillary costs.
Yes, and I think, thanks for putting a finer point on that, Julie. And I think, we're going to move into talking about the pandemic. And I know Steve and Quentin both have examples of how the pandemic has increased demand for these programs. But first, Quentin and Steve, I just wanted to open it up if you all wanted to talk a little bit about how students currently cover the cost of these short-term programs, since a lot of them can't access Pell. And like we just talked about, WIOA funding is also kind of hard to come by. Can you just talk about how currently students can cover those costs?
Do you want me to go first, Steve, or you want to go?
Yeah, you go ahead.
Okay, so the short answer is they pay for it out of pocket. I mean, that's it. So it's either you have it or you don't, right? And this, in my mind, is where the equity issue comes into play, right? Because let's face it, not everybody has $2,500 or $5,000 to drop on a program, right? Because as you all just mentioned, all of those other life expenses, you either have to decide, am I going to pay for childcare this week or this month? Or am I going to drop $500 on a forklift operator program? Those are the challenges and the decisions that our students are having to make. And so they're paying for it out of pocket. And what we found real quickly is in our recent deep dive in the data, while 52% of our credit students are minority, 70% of our workforce students are non-minority. So what that tells us is they have the resources and the ability to pay for those programs themselves, whereas the other folks don't. And what are we going to do to make sure that everybody has access to these great short-term workforce training programs that are going to help them go out and earn a good living? And so they pay for it out of their own pockets, Katie. I don't know if Steve want to add to that.
So I would add to that. I mean, we have things like payment plans, but that doesn't necessarily help you if you still don't have the funds to make those minimum payments. I think when I joined the college, there was basically internal college generated scholarships and our long-term Pell programs were about our only two options for financial aid in addition to WIOA. Recently, in the last 2 years, Maryland has funded something through the Higher Education Commission called our Workforce Development Sequence Scholarship. And so we apply, every college, it's a set amount of money, like the first half of the disbursement gets equally distributed between the 16 community colleges, and the other half is distributed based on FTE, so enrollment. Those funds are earmarked for workforce development short-term programs. And so each college will apply or essentially apply for their program. And as long as it meets very minimal criteria as far as more than one course, has to lead to a credential and a few other things, it gets funded. And it's up to $2,000 and you can fund yourself for over 2 years. So you could take 2 different trainings. You could, if the training program spanned a fiscal year, you could use $2,000 in the first fiscal year and finish it up in the second. So you can get up to $4,000 to pay for a more expensive program. So that's something that is pretty unique, that has taken place in the last few years, that has really impacted our ability to help these students get funding. I mean, we try to offer resources and links to other scholarships, but those only go so far. So the good news is there's been consistent growth in workforce funding. So
right. Thanks to both of you. I think it puts it into perspective kind of what students need to go through in order to cover the cost of a particular subset of programs, rather than if they just enrolled in a longer program, it would be more streamlined. It just kind of sheds light on that issue. So I know, Quentin, you just talked through kind of how students, have to pay out of pocket for a lot of these programs. And I see that problem getting even more dire as we look to a pandemic recovery, because, we've all heard, and I think we all know that community and technical colleges and the programs offered there are going to play a huge role in the recovery and getting people the education and training they need to get back into the workforce, especially people who have been displaced from their jobs that may or may not come back. After the pandemic, we're not sure how industries will be impacted yet. for the long term. So I know that LCTCS used some CARES Act funding to launch a program called Reboot Your Career. And for those on the call, CARES Act funding was federal funding that was allocated out in response to the pandemic. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that project, Quentin, and if you've seen like an uptick in demand for programs and kind of what your outlook is there.
Oh yeah, so Governor Edwards, our governor here, he allocated $10 million towards this reboot program, and it's essentially what you just talked about. Folks who either lost their jobs because of the pandemic, or folks who just are unemployed or underemployed and just really need an opportunity to get in and get retrained, maybe for another career. Louisiana, as you probably all know, is hospitality and tourism is a huge part of our of our economy. Same with oil and gas, right? Well, guess what? Both of those industries have been decimated by this pandemic. And so we have tens of thousands of individuals who they need help. And so what we did was we took the $10 million that the governor used in his discretionary funds, and we're providing up to $1,500 towards somebody coming in and taking advantage of a program. We basically used the same programs that our regional economic development officer said we're hiring for right now today. We looked at those and we said, okay, which of these programs can we get people in and out, again, 8 weeks or less, that we can help put at least $1,500 towards them receiving an education. And so one of the examples I love to use is a forklift operator, right? So we've got people who were making minimum wage, and minimum wage in Louisiana is awful, right? $7 and some change. It's criminal, but that's a different conversation. And so we're able to get these folks who might have been working as a housekeeper at a hotel, maybe that might have been on the maintenance staff. We're able to get them in, put $1,500 towards the program, and they're coming out and going from $7 an hour to $15 an hour. Might not mean much to the people on this call, but I can assure you it means a whole heck of a lot for somebody who was making $7 an hour or no money, right, to be able to double their income. But our hope is that they see, man, I did this in 4 weeks. What could I do if I went back and earned another credential, right? Do I go from now $15 to $25 and $25 into management, on and on and on? So that's kind of how we're positioning it. I'm happy to say that we've had, since the last time you and I spoke, Katie, we're upwards of about 3,000 inquiries. People said, hey, I want in on that program. We've had well over 1,000 of those people actually get enrolled. And we just got the data back this morning that we've had 347 people who have earned a short-term credential in the last couple of months since we kicked this program off. So we believe that we're gonna run through the $10 million, right? But here's the key, it's one-time money, right? Unless Congress does something, which is another conversation around another stimulus package, we're gonna have to try to find a way to reinvest in that program, and that's what we're looking at, an adult promise type deal, but that's down the line. We've got to get some legislative approval locally for that. So we're having some success with our reboot program.
Julie, did you want to add something?
Sure. I just wanted to pick up, first of all, it's so exciting to hear what you all are doing down there. And only underscores the importance of having this conversation now, right? And you say, Congress is going to do something, that's a whole other conversation. I think it's really, Congress will do something, I think, give it a couple of weeks, but we'll at some point do another stimulus here in Washington, and turning the corner, really looking at the nation's recovery. And the nation's recovery is not only economic stimulus checks and not only getting our healthcare system back in order and getting a vaccine out the door. All of those things are critical. Programs like this and investing in the talent of our country is equally critical. And I do think that this very conversation has a really big role to play when those conversations come around. And so we're not going to see regular order and regular debates about particular pieces of legislation here in Washington for some time. What we will see is this conversation, and exactly on point, and I want to underscore like 3 times how Quentin and the folks in Louisiana are looking at it.
That's actually a good, you kind of answered my next question, Julie. I was going to ask, because I think historically we've talked about this change to Pell as being part of maybe a Higher Education Act reauthorization, which is the largest federal policy focused on higher ed. And I know at least our members, we've been talking about how important that reauthorization is for a while. And so we were kind of thinking of short-term Pell as being folded into that. But I think the point you made, like maybe the conversation we need to have sooner is how do we fold it into a recovery package and what does that look like? So I think that's super important. And Steve, I wanted to give you a chance to comment too on whether you're seeing kind of an increase in demand in terms of the pandemic and how the pandemic has impacted your campus.
Sure. No, we have definitely seen an impact, a huge increase in demand. I would say our institution has really sort of been aggressive with trying to implement safe practices to make the campuses safe. We've implemented sort of this more of a hybrid learning model so we can be able to continue to serve as many students as possible. We've done a great job of moving things online where appropriate, but at the same time, implementing screening and cleaning and sanitation protocols. So we actually have, seen a huge uptick and have been able to meet that demand because we are, as our president says, we are open. So I think one thing that we've benefited from is the GEARS Act or the GEARS Fund as part of the CARES Act. So that's the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund. And so CCBC has earmarked 1.2 million specific for workforce programs. And so our president definitely recognizes the importance of these shorter term workforce programs and directs funding. She could have easily put it towards credit programs and did in a smaller amount, but prioritize those workforce programs because of the impact they have in the community. And so, particularly healthcare, our healthcare programs, and Maryland's a bit unique in that we get state aid for non-credit students as well as for workforce students. So we have a very robust offering on the non-credit side versus other states that might have the same programs, but on the credit side of the college. So, it's good in some ways, but bad in the others, but our president recognizes it and it has provided some funding for it, so.
Katie, can I just mention something on the CARES Act? And,
Sure.
and Julie, you and your team and ACCT and AACC can help us with this. And it's not a part of the discussion, but forgive me, it's on my heart. When and if there is another stimulus package, we've got to be sure, because we're leaving out a whole nother population of our community college students, because if you're not full-time or a certain number of hours, you're not getting anything. I mean, that is just fundamentally wrong. It's not how you should be treating people, right? It goes again to equity. So whatever you all can do to help on the Hill with ensuring that all of our students can access those funds, I know we'd all be very appreciative of that.
Absolutely. Thanks, Quentin. That's a great point. I think it just goes right back to your equity comments earlier. Just, I think, whether it's intended or not, I think we treat students differently depending on kind of their own path and what they're pursuing. And I think this pandemic has really put a huge spotlight on that, on the inequities that are in our higher education system. And so you're right. I think we really need to keep that in mind moving forward into recovery. We only have about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, José, who's gonna just try to ask us as many questions as he can in 5 minutes. So José, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Katie. And I'll get right started with the question so that we don't lose any time. So the first question, and I think, Julie, you might be the best person to answer this, but will this proposal on short-term, will the proposal that is currently being discussed in Congress in terms of FAFSA reform include short-term Pell, and is this going to be addressed in the lame duck?
Sure. So just to back up for everyone, there is, in this time period between now and the end of the year, there's been discussion about moving forward some FAFSA simplification, mainly because this is the priority of Chairman Alexander, who leads the Senate committee that covers education, who's retiring at the end of the year. And so it's been kind of this long understanding that he's going to make one final push for his top priority. I think the legislative days are few, and the list of things that Congress needs to get done in those few days is long. So the path forward that my short answer is no. I don't think so. I'm actually quite pessimistic on the ability to get a FAFSA package through, and that is largely bipartisan. I think anything that happens right now need to be completely non-controversial, bipartisan, and not that expensive. And while there's many people who, on both sides of the aisle, who agree with this, the devil's always in the details in policymaking. And there are some critical details, such as whether to include for-profit colleges, that have big partisan divides that still need to be worked out. So I think the lame duck's hard to think about. I think early next year, though, is a great possibility.
Awesome, thank you. And for the purposes of time, I know we have a couple more questions, but I do want to make sure that we get a couple of last thoughts from all the speakers. So we will answer to your questions directly via email for those that are still pending, but I want to pose this question for all the panelists, including you, Katie. Considering that there are few legislative days left, we're ramping up and preparing for the 117th Congress. This is going to continue being a priority for ACCT and for many of you here in the room. What are some, for those that are in the audience that want to push for this issue and want to advocate for in front of their members of Congress and their senators, what advice do you give them and how to approach that advocacy? And if I can have, maybe Julie, you can start and then we'll go around.
Sure. Storytelling, data, and clear asks are my three things. I think making sure that you're talking to your members who represent you. Community colleges have the greatest advantage in that there's a community college in every congressional district. So talk to your member, get to know their staff at home, get to know their staff in DC, but also be mindful of most staff, especially here in DC, don't have a firm grasp. They probably went to a 4-year selective institution. So telling that story from the institution perspective and having your students tell their stories about the programs and the kind of outcomes is absolutely critical. And can I put in a little plug? Higher Learning Advocates runs Today's Students Coalition, which is a coalition of 26 organizations fighting for a broad agenda for today's students. So one, I urge you to check that out. Two, we also have a storytelling platform on that webpage, and that institutions, students can go ahead and record or type out their story. And we use those stories to connect with our federal policy advocacy.
Thank you very much, Julie. Quentin, how about you? Any last wise words?
No, Julie said it right. I mean, it's really about storytelling, because everybody can agree that regardless of what side of the aisle you're on, when something is good for people and it lifts, everybody up, and that's what we do at community colleges. So yeah, storytelling is at the front of the line, right?
Thank you very much, Quentin. Steve?
I would have to say to Julie's point that don't assume that the people that you're speaking to on the Hill understand where you're coming from. I think I've been surprised that when you start talking about the experiences of community college students, in our case, that their eyes, light up and they're like, wow, I had no idea. And it's because they didn't have the same experiences. So sharing the experiences, bringing awareness to the issues, I think is important.
Thank you very much, Steve. Katie, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, everyone said it fantastic. I think, like Julie mentioned on the call, there is a divide still between workforce and higher education and federal policy. And I think, just to echo Steve, not everyone really understands that that's a problem or can be a barrier to students. So student stories, but also just coming at the issue like you're educating someone who's brand new to it, I think is a really good approach, and we'll need a lot of it going into next Congress. So I know we're going to close out. I wanted to put one last slide up on the screen. Thank you to all of our panelists who made this conversation very robust. I thought it was a great discussion. I wanted to just mention that ACCT, we annually hold what we call the National Legislative Summit every year, where people who attend, get to meet with their federal policymakers, hear a lot of programming, kind of figure out how to advocate for the issues that they care most about. And so that will take place this coming February 7th through the 10th next year, which is coming up very soon. So you can find more information on that on our website, nls.acct.org. We hope that you can join us and check it out. And then otherwise, just thank you so much. As I mentioned at the top of the call, this is recorded. We will make sure we get to all of the questions we didn't get to. We'll reach out to you via email. And for additional resources, please go to our website. And I will share the PowerPoint also with everyone who attended. I just got that question in the chat. So thank you all again so much for joining, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.